Thank you everyone for joining Darien Library this beautiful Tuesday evening for the life and art of Paul Cezanne with Paige Knox. Paige Knox is an adjunct professor at the Art History Department of Columbia University, where she received her PhD in 2012. She works in a variety of capacities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, giving public gallery talks and lectures in special exhibitions, as well as permanent collection, teaching classes at the museum and leading groups for travel with the Met. She's got her hands full. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make this program, as well as our collections, available to the community. If you have any questions this evening, please type your questions in the Q&A, and Paige will be happy to answer them at the end of the program. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige. I hope everyone's excited to learn.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda. I also want to thank Pat, who's worked diligently to get me speaking with you all, and also think about things that are relevant, about things that are related to contemporary exhibitions. And this particular talk is certainly a part of that. So I'm going to share my screen and take us to the world of Cezanne. And as I was saying, we're trying to do programming that's going to be relevant to you and to things that you're going to be seeing. And there is a very marvelous Cezanne exhibition that is opening. I wish I was going to tell you it was opening at the Met. It's opening at MoMA. It's opening in June. And because I'm not affiliated with MoMA, I don't know what's going to be in the show. But I do know that it's going to be 200 examples of primarily works on paper, with a couple of very key paintings taken from the MoMA's collection, which I can expect will be the Lily Bliss Bather and possibly the Rockefeller painting that was recently given to them. But the focus is going to be works on paper. So what I thought I would do tonight would be to give you just a prep, kind of a overview of Cezanne, and in terms of kind of creating a primer for the show. As I don't know what's going to be in it, I tried to pick out some works that, while they may not be works on paper or watercolors, I think they're going to be indicative of what kind of things you're going to be seeing in the exhibition. And I love this quote by Cezanne. He said, "The painter gives concrete expression to his sensations, perceptions, by means of line and color." And I'm going to argue that Cezanne spends his decades-long career really dedicating himself to doing just that, to constantly experimenting with different materials, with different techniques, to really record his sensations about what he's seeing. And in thinking about works on paper, particularly as it relates to the show, I decided to focus on works that Cezanne leaves somewhat unfinished in the beginning of my talk, because I think that these kind of unfinished works will speak a great deal to what he's also trying to achieve in drawing. Now, I'm not going to be talking that much about the drawings because, again, I'm not entirely sure what MoMA is going to offer, but I would expect they're going to cover a wide range of subjects, which are also covered in his painting. So I'm going to basically be showing you the bathers, the still lives, the landscapes, the Saint-Victoire, the apples, all of these images which Cezanne worked over again and again and again in this attempt to really record his sensations. And I will say that he was someone that did, in terms of what relates to the show, he did do a number of drawings, works on paper, which were independent. He never really made underdrawings in his paintings, but I think both paintings, drawings, works on paper were all part of this larger desire to really record his sensations. So what I'm going to try to do again is looking at all of these different genres, landscape, portraiture, still life, to really bring in a particular aesthetic, the aesthetic of Cezanne, and focus on this specific approach, if you will. So Cezanne's born in 1849, he dies in 1906. He lives through 5 decades of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and early modernism, but always has a unique style. And I always say you can't pigeonhole Cezanne into an ism. but he seems to lay the foundations for modernism, for modern art. He's adored by the critics. Picasso and Matisse call him the father of us all. And you'll see that over time, every decade, every time period has its own Cezanne, and particular art historians, particular critics, from Roger Fry to Clement Greenberg to Meyer Shapiro to MoMA curators today, have written about him extensively. And there's always seems like there's a Cezanne show going on. In fact, when I saw this Cezanne, I thought, well, it's been a while since there's been a Cezanne show in New York, and this makes a lot of sense, particularly given COVID. It's something that so appeals to us, but I believe it was actually planned pre-COVID, but a wonderful way to see the work. Now, unlike many of his Impressionist contemporaries, the work of Cezanne was really not well received when he was alive. It wasn't until his death, quite frankly, that he became this godlike figure. But the work has been seen and examined and discussed in so many ways. So my attempt to sort of focus on this unfinished aesthetic, which might in painting mimic what is going on in drawings, which you're going to see in the show, I think was critical to his practice. And I think it was also appropriate for his personality, because he was unpredictable. He was, things left unfinished in an interesting way. He was distrusting of others. That's a very important aspect of who he was. And he was very aware that he thought that finished work was for imbeciles. So he loved this idea of the sketch, and that's something that's really quite critical. Now, he'll leave Paris for Provence in the 1880s and never really come back. So the end of his life is spent very much in this hermit type existence. What I want to do is kind of focus on more work in this unfinished style from the later part of his career, and then go back and give you a kind of a general overview of the life, of the career, and some of these kind of recognizable forms, figures, and topics. So this is a painting of a town called Garden. And Garden was really a place for him that he spent a great deal of time in. Now, one of the things about Cezanne is he's from the south. He's from the south of France. And this is a really critical element to who he was. And he loved to play up this aspect of being the Provençal. He loved to suggest that he was uncouth and unsophisticated and kind of the country bumpkin, if you will, when he was in Paris. But this is actually not entirely true. His father had purchased a beautiful estate in the south of France. The family lived quite nicely, and they were from a relatively affluent, fairly well off. And as a result, Cezanne never had to work. And this was something that was very, very important as it relates to this painting, because Cezanne's father gave him an allowance that was critical to him. And in order to maintain this allowance, he kept secrets from his father. And one of his secrets was kept in this town of Darien, and that was his mistress, Hortense Fiquet, who at this point, when he's painted this painting, has been with him for about 15 years and has given birth to a son. She was a seamstress. She was from the eastern part of France. She was not very sophisticated, and Cezanne did not think his father would take kindly to the fact that this allowance was going to take care of this mistress. And so he kept it from his father. And when he was living in the family estate in the Jas de Buffon, he would walk from the Jas de Buffon to Garden every day, walk back and forth, 7-mile walk. And I always sort of envisioned Cezanne walking up this hill to basically reconnect with Hortense and his young child. So to me, the canvas has this unfinished sketchiness, the kind of thing that you're going to see, I believe, in the show. And I think there's something about the rawness of it and the drawing of it that reveals an understanding of not only his deep awareness of the town and his familiarity with every brick and every stone, but also how he creates a painting. So the unfinished nature of this work really makes you focus on the forms, and in a way, it encourages you as the viewer to complete it. So when you look at, and he says, I have to work constantly, but not in order to achieve finish, which only attracts the attention of imbeciles. He wasn't interested in that. Now, this is Gardin, and I have to confess, I wish that I could magically Photoshop out or somehow airbrush away the nuclear reactor plant. I think sometimes that we have these very romantic visions of the south of France, and the power plant doesn't really fit into that kind of romantic idealized view. So if you could just sort of remove the power plant, this is what Gardin looks like today. And I think what's fascinating is to think about, what does he take from the landscape? What does he use? Well, he takes certainly the palette, the colors, and that's the joy of these Cezanne paintings. You feel like you're in the south of France. They really give you the colors of the sky and the trees and the hill towns with the church, with the red tile roofs. And he really is very aware of that. But what he's also showing you is how one thing is kind of built on top of another. And so you get the structure, you get the essence of this town itself in this particular way, I think, in this image. And when you look at other images that he does, you'll also see, again, with this unfinished style, and this is oil and Conte crayon, these are the things you're going to see in the show, but how, again, the building blocks of the structures kind of come together. Now, the Brooklyn picture is a bit more finished than the Met picture, but I think, both of them are about these essential forms, reducing things down to the basics. And when you look at the third image of Gardin, which is at the Barns, you can see a more finished depiction of the town, of the three, really. You can see this one as, I think, the most complete. And I think what it really offers you is a different way of thinking about how Cezanne is looking at this town in different ways. So whether the vertical images kind of reorient you in sort of an upward climb to the peak where Hortense, I like to kind of think of her as sort of a 19th century version of Rapunzel, hiding in the high tower, but she's in one of these buildings. But you get this feeling of the journey, making your way up. The Barnes picture is a bit more of a tourist view, I think. It's probably more accurate, but I tend to prefer these sketchier views because I think it's more of a mental image of the environment, and you get the sense of the quintessential forms, if you will, from Cezanne. And this was something that also appealed very much to artists like Picasso. Picasso takes this geometric structure from Cezanne, gets rid of all the extraneous detail, and really kind of results in this very early Cubist picture. So in a way, Cezanne is the beginning of Cubism. He paves the way for these kinds of images. Now, another work that I wanted to focus on in terms of this unfinished style, the sketchiness that will probably resemble some of the drawings in the show, is the view of the Domaine Saint-Joseph. Now, this was a very small estate for Jesuit monks that was located in the hills of Provence, very close to the Jastre de Buffon. It was situated in a little hamlet. And of course, Cezanne spends his childhood wandering through these hills. This is where he grows up. But in the 1880s, he starts to use this very particular style. It's kind of a quintessential brushstroke. You'll see it's something, it's very thin paint. And I'm sure he's going to be doing this in drawings you're going to see in the show as well, with these diagonal, irregular brushstrokes. And so it looks very sketchy, although he does sign the painting. So we know that he considered it to be finished. And interesting about this painting, in spite of its sketchiness, it was actually purchased by the Met. It was owned by the dealer Villard. And when Cezanne died, Villard sent a number of works to the Armory Show, a very important exhibition that took place in New York City in 1913. It was often seen as modern art arriving in America. And this was a work that was in that exhibition, bought by the Met, really as a way to have an example of modern art. So the Met very early on recognizes Cezanne. But what I want to show you is how he uses this bare canvas in places to show you the depth of field. So essentially by using the bare canvas, he infuses light behind plants and behind bushes. So there becomes this kind of a 3D aspect of the landscape, and the light almost seems to come from within. So there's this internal illumination. And you see this little house that's kind of in the center of all of it that brings everything together. And then you notice the brushstroke when you look closely, the hand of the artist, these Southern Provençal colors, the violets and the pinks, all calling attention to this very diagonal brushwork. And, he said about Impressionism, he said, I wanted to make of impression something solid and durable, like the art of museums. And I think what he felt was, when it came to the Impressionists, and he does exhibit with the Impressionists, we'll talk about this in a bit, he thought it was too easy. He thought it was too quick. Monet goes down, takes his canvas, takes his easel, sets up on the side of the Seine, paints the boats that he sees quickly, rapidly. It's very fast. And that was what Impressionism was all about, the spontaneity and the immediacy. But he has lived his life coming from this very ancient place of Provence. And he sees it as ancient, both in terms of its history with the Gauls and the Romans and the fossils that he finds in the hills, but also the history of his own life. And he wants to make something solid of that. So he, in many ways, he paves the way for the next phase, and thinking about somebody like Matisse, who was quite obsessed with Cezanne. And he's thinking about these same ideas of creating these open spaces, the light from behind that sort of illuminates the brushwork. And interesting about Matisse, when he got married, his father-in-law gave him a dowry. And you tend to think, when you get married, your father-in-law gives you a dowry, you put a down payment on a house. He bought he bought a Cezanne Bathers painting. So that shows you where his priorities were, but how important Cezanne was to these early modernist painters like Matisse and Picasso. Now, another work that I see as very sketchy and unfinished in this kind of style that would reveal the drawing and the draftsmanship in the sketch is this image of Madame Cezanne. And this is in the Metz collection. And this painting always elicits a lot of conversation because Madame Cezanne is a challenging subject to get your arms around. Cezanne painted her 29 times. And she was literally his long-suffering wife, because not only was, at this point, she is finally married to him, but she has to wait 17 long years before he finally marries her. But she sat for him, and sitting for Cezanne was arduous. It took a long time. He was very methodical. He was very deliberate. He spent hours agonizing over each brushstroke, and she had the patience to persevere as one of his most frequent subjects. Now, the painting that's shown here, she is now Madame Cezanne. She's not hiding out in Garden anymore. But we know that most of Cezanne's friends did not care for her. Interestingly, Émile Zola, who was Cezanne's closest childhood friend, had written around the time of the marriage a very controversial novel called L'Œuvre, which translates as masterpiece. And it was very loosely based on the life of Cezanne. And Cezanne realized this immediately. And it had not very good things to say about Hortense. And not very nice things to say about Cezanne terribly either. And I think in many ways, the book kind of motivated Cezanne to sort of say, well, here's to you, Zola, I'm going to marry this woman anyway. Although apparently right after the marriage, he went out with buddies and, stayed up all night drinking with his friends and basically ignored her. But once she married him, she did start buying clothes. She had sort of a reputation of being a clothes horse. And this angered him, and he ultimately writes her out of the will. And he doesn't divorce her, but he kind of dismisses her. So this is kind of a moment before that happens that this image is done. And you can see she's got this beautiful blue dress on with these very, very interesting gloves that show her fingers. But more than anything else, it's the focus on the face. You go right to that face, right? You are drawn to, they called it the boule, which was her very recognizable hairstyle. But what I want to underscore is that while this is sketchy, and you see the underdrawing, and you do see, in this case, there is an underdrawing, and you do see the forms, you get nothing emotionally from this picture. There's no tenderness, there's no affection. It is just about the form, right? That is all he is concerned about with, is capturing what he's seeing. And as I said, she sits for him 29 times. Now, in the history of art, she has always been marginalized. She has always been put in a box. And scholars recently have been trying to resurrect her and give her own agency. But I think it's challenging, A, because so many art historians were quite brutal to her, but also Cezanne doesn't allow you to engage with her. He doesn't really let you get to know her. She has a remoteness and an emptiness. And you get the sense that, you know, she really wasn't allowed to express herself. Now, there are other, he said, I wanted to achieve a realization. But again, I think it's more of about form than about who she is as a person. Now, there are other images that are slightly more finished, pictures of her. There's actually wonderful image. This is in the Met's collection. It's one of a series of 4 pictures that were all done, same dress, same chair, same space, and he's experimenting with her. And again, she's sitting for these long periods of time and allowing him to explore all these various elements. But I think in many ways, the unfinished picture that you see here is a little bit more open-ended. So she looks directly at you, but again, we still don't break through. And as I said, you know, you can look at these pictures of her over and over and over. He paints 29 times, and you're never really going to get there. You're never really going to see her in that way. Now, this is an interesting image, and I think it's just recently come to light, and I think it's very indicative of some of the things you're going to see in the show. It's 1902, 1906, so towards the end of his life, right before he dies. And it's an oil on canvas, but it has this great level of unfinished to it. And as I said, you know, he wrote this letter, which I think is talking about, you know, his what he's attempting to do. And I think that it's really captured here in this image. He said, so old as I am, around 70 years, he was actually 66 when he wrote this letter, the sensation colorant that create light are the cause of abstractions that do not allow me to cover my canvas, nor to pursue the delimitation of objects when their points of contact are subtle or delicate, the result of which is my image or painting is incomplete. So he's saying, because I want to really understand these sensations of color that create light, that seem to almost cause abstract forms, I can't create a finished work. I can't do it. But what is interesting about this picture is that, and this is a watercolor that is often seen to be relating to it. It was a work that, the one on the left was a work that was sold at auction. And it has been argued, even though at this point he has dismissed her, written out of her out of the will, she's moved back to Paris and she's basically, you know, on her own, being supported by their son, but no contact with Cezanne. But what a particular art historian named Susan Sedlauskas has argued is that this is Hortense, who has come back for the final image, right? And this is what she says. And by the way, this is very controversial. This is not, there's no factual evidence about this, but this is what Susan Sedlauskas says about this painting that you see on the bottom right. She said, she is indisputably, stubbornly there, over and over, a constant figure who inspired an array of variations that present her as newly made every time. Cezanne kept coming back to her in his work. In Seated Woman, if I am right, again, she's not sure, it's conjecture. If I am right, she came back one last time. She sits at the table that provided the stage for so many of the artist's still life arrangements and was at the center of his studio, at the center of his practice. By being there, Hortense Viquet-Cezanne sat with her husband and became his art. So she's arguing that this sketch work on paper is the last of Hortense. We don't know that, but I think, again, this lack of finish, in many ways, I think it's a painting that that raises the question, was she at the center, as Sadlauskas argues, or was she on the margins? Was she, in an abusive relationship, or was she a willing participant? We will never know. Susan Sadlauskas thinks she's at the center. But again, these paintings in their sketchiness, I think, offer different ways for you to think about it. As I said, feminist art historians are trying to reposition this body of work. There was a show at the Met about Madame Cezanne and all these pictures brought together, and you could see all of them. But even after seeing them all, you're still uncertain about it, sort of leaving it open-ended, if you will. Now, another image that I wanted, so here again, we see her in all these different guises, but we never know her. Now, another image that was done towards the end of the career that I think is very similar to what you're going to see in the show is this bouquet of peonies in a green jar. And it's really an example of color and light making their mark on Cezanne's work. He rarely used flowers. He didn't like flowers. He prefers apples because flowers are, and when he does use flowers, they're generally artificial. And the issue with flowers is that they didn't last. They were very fragile, if you will. But he did love the openness of the flowers, the blossoms, the randomness, because there's a lightness and there's a freedom but it did require him to paint quickly, which he doesn't like. He likes the apple, which lasts for a long time and gives him plenty of time to kind of think about. So for him, the apples were something that were tangible, something that were physical, something that you could hold on to. And so you actually see in these flowers more of a loosening up, if you will, from the volume and from the form. And the air actually starts to kind of enter into that whole, that moment. But what I want to do, so again, I'm just seeing some unfinished work, and I think that's going to be very indicative of what's going to be in the MoMA show. But I'd like to now kind of put all of those works into the larger career and think about how the sketch fits into this body of work. So as I said, Cezanne is born in 1839 and he dies in 1906. He has a good 5 decades of engaging with this rapidly changing art world. Now, as I mentioned, he comes from Provence and he loved to play the country bumpkin, but he went to a very sophisticated boys' school in Provence where he was reading Plato and Aristotle. This is where he meets Emile Zola. They become these lifelong friends. There's actually, I always like to recommend films to people. There's a wonderful film called Cezanne et moi that's about his relationship with Zola. And you see the boys running through the hills of Provence. It's quite a lovely film. And Zola will move to Paris. Cezanne will follow him. Cezanne's father, though, wants his son to be a lawyer. He wants him to have a profession. His father was a hat maker who became a banker, who made it, and wants his son to not, be a tradesman, a craftsman, an artist. So he enters the local law school, but it doesn't really work for him. And then following Zola, he goes to Paris in 1861. He tries to enter the école. He submits work to the annual exhibition, which is the Salon. He doesn't really get a lot of traction. And you'll see for much of his life, he's actually always moving back and forth between Paris and the South. And then, as we'll see, in the 1870s, he engages with the Impressionists. In the 1880s, he turns his back on them, comes back to Provence. 1890s, really starts to become kind of a hermit. This is when Hortense leaves. And he, all this time, no one's buying the work. As I mentioned, it's not till 1895 in an exhibition that's organized by his dealer Villard that he actually starts to get some attention. And Villard has this one-man show, explodes on the scene. He's in his late 60s when it happens. And then really the next major show is right after, just before he dies in 1905. And this is a transformative moment. But the early work, you can see, and what's so fascinating about Cezanne is how he changes from decade to decade, from kind of moment to moment. So the early work, the palette is very thick, using a palette knife. And he frequently uses his uncle Dominic, who was a mailman, as his subject. And Uncle Dominic was very willing to dress up to play all these different figures. So here we see him, you know, looking very sort of like some kind of a Turk. And then my personal favorite is him looking like a monk, because he's Uncle Dominic, so he's a Dominican monk, even though he's the mailman. But what you notice in this style, in this early work, is the style that was called carade. And that was a kind of, again, this is Cezanne saying, I'm a rough and tumble guy from Provence. Carade was actually translated as ballsy. So very thick, very heavy, very kind of almost sort of macho in a way. And it did not sell in Paris. Paris was, you know, Parisians were not interested in this work at all. This is a portrait of his father. And I love this picture because people have often written about the problematic relationship that he had with his father, who was obviously never, always said to not be happy with his son's choices, but he does allow him to paint him. And he also includes a still life of his work behind. So to me, I think, you know, he was supportive of his son, and there was an element of, you know, unhappiness about the career, but I think that, you know, the allowance itself suggests that there was some kind of support. Now, this is a portrait that was actually in the Met's collection, believed to be the self-portrait when it was originally acquired, but now attributed to a man, the likeness of a man named Gustave Boyer. But again, what I like about it is that, and this is the actual self-portrait, but again, it's the rough and tumble that Cezanne always loved to play up. You know, when he first met Manet, Manet shook his hand and he said, "Oh, I can't shake your hand, I haven't washed in a week." So he loved to kind of be that kind of, that outlier, that difficult guy. And that was very much of his, part of hhis persona. Now, the early work in the late 1860s, he was very interested in Delacroix, Jaricot, Courbet, Romanticism and realism, all of these things that are going on in Paris at the time. But he was also drawn to these very gruesome subjects, murder, rape. I never been terribly fond of this body of work, but it didn't sell very well either. But it's not until the 1870s when the palette lightens up. And this is really when you start to see him engaging with the Impressionists, particularly with Pissarro. So he meets Pissarro, and it's Pissarro who introduces him to en plein air painting. So he gets him outside and really engaging in the landscape. And this is a Pissarro painting that I think looks like a Cezanne. So it's interesting that Pissarro is more Cezanne than Cezanne in the beginning. And then Cezanne will actually move towards this style when Pissarro kind of goes in a slightly different direction. But they're spending a lot of time together and really enjoying each other's company. And he basically brings him into the Impressionist group. So this is a scene, fantastic scene, a fisherman that was shown in the 1877 show. 16 works by Cezanne are shown in that exhibition. It's the same show where you're seeing Monet showing the Gare Saint-Lazare, and a lot of very quintessential Impressionist style. Cezanne doesn't really fit in that way. This is a work that looks back to a lot of other earlier artists, looks back to Manet, who's looking back to Rubens, it looks back to Titian, it looks back to Watteau. And I think it's a real statement about the fact that Cezanne is in the Louvre when he's in Paris, really looking very closely at the old masters and learning what he can, but taking those old masters and making that work his own, if you will. Now, this is also when he's embracing the still life. And these objects are placed in space really rethinking the whole notion of one-point perspective. And he was aware that that was something that was so critical to Western painting all the way back to the Renaissance. But he says, vision is dynamic, and I want to show you how you actually look at something. You don't look at something with a fixed viewpoint. You're thinking about the larger picture, and it's a much more dynamic image, and he's showing you that. And this is when he's painting, again, the early works of Hortense. They have met in the early 1870s. She's living with him. It's easier to tell the time period of the paintings based on the wallpaper and the interiors of the apartments than the face of Hortense, because she kind of has this timeless, kind of emotionless image that we see a lot. So this is Dish of Apples, also in that third Impressionist show. And you get the sense, again, of the work is very rough. You know, he's doing things that are not quite as a part of the rest of the group. Now, this is Victor Choquet, who was one of the few collectors of Cezanne. Unlike some of his contemporaries who were selling work, he really did not sell much at all. And Choquet was one of the few who was supportive of him. Now you start to see these apples take over in a way. And the apples are very, as I said, they're very intentional. They're very studied. They're very determined. He apparently looked so hard at apples that his eyes bulged out of his head. And he was somebody that wanted to very much explore the volume and the three-dimensionality of these things on a two-dimensional surface, but in a dynamic way. And you can see that again and again and again in these images. And I'm certain in the MoMA show, you're going to see a lot of drawings which also engage with this still life form. And this is a studio which, you know, shows you the basic elements that he's constantly using over and over and over again. The table you see continuously reappearing. But he did say, with an apple, I want to astonish Paris. And what he really wants to do is push the envelope on the whole idea of vision. And if you think back to the talk I think I gave you all a while back on Hockney, Hockney also was very interested in this concept of debunking perspective and thinking about how we see in the larger world, and that vision is not static. And he wants to show you that as these apples almost come falling off. These are not still life. These are moving life, right? And the apple is the perfect form for him because it's round, it's hard, it's durable. It's not like the flowers that are fragile. And he can really kind of get his arms around it and focus in on it in a way. Now, and you can see how the still life becomes more and more and more dynamic as he explores this idea. Now, when I was studying at Columbia, Meyer Shapiro had already passed away, but Meyer Shapiro was considered to be kind of the god of Columbia art history. And he wrote a great deal about Cezanne's apples. And he felt that they actually showed latent erotic tendencies. You know, Eve, the fall of man, the sexual connotations. I have never been fully convinced about this argument. But again, it is, I think, a demonstration of how every generation has their Cezanne and how Cezanne speaks to people at different times about different subjects. But I think what Shapiro wanted to get at is, why does he keep painting these apples over and over and over and over and over again? You know, what do they mean? Personally, I think it's no different than Hortense being painted over and over again. I think he was trying to get at the essence of form. That to me was what it was about. But it's a very interesting idea. So in addition to still life, in addition to portraiture, we have landscape. And the landscape really begins to play a major role in the 1880s when he goes back to the south of France. So as I said, in the 1870s, he's in Paris a great deal and fully engaging with Impressionism. But in the 1880s, he kind of turns his back on the whole scene and comes back to the south of France, brings Hortense with him. And he's really rethinking the whole idea of landscape painting. And of course, rejecting that perspectival point of view and embracing color and form. And you really see that in this image of the Gulf of Marseille seen from L'Estaque. And if you know the area, and again, just ignore some of the more recent modern additions, it really is a village about color and the local color and the roofs. And he says, seeing this vision of L'Estaque is like a playing card. Red roofs over the blue sea. The sun is so bright here that it seems to me as if the objects were silhouetted not only in black and white, but in blue, red, brown, and violet. So really thinking about color here and thinking about form and how the colors and the forms create this underlying essence, the essential, you know, the joy of Cezanne, when you look at these pictures, you feel like you're in the south of France. He transports you in that way. And so, of course, now that brings us to Saint-Victoire, another major subject matter for him. He paints it in both paint over 15 times, and between the drawings, the works on paper, and the paintings, apparently over 100 images of Saint-Victoire. But what again, and I mentioned this earlier, he said, I sought to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. So he wants to take this mountain that is so much a part of his childhood and think about it as an ancient form, a solid form. And as I mentioned, it very much plays into the history of the region. There was a war in 100 BC between the Gauls and the Romans, which the Romans won, and apparently the blood could be seen coming down the mountainside, and that was why it's called Saint-Victoire. But there are antiquities in this landscape, and there were fossils in these landscapes, and you know, his own childhood is totally bound up in this landscape. So he's thinking about, and if you've been to the south of France, if you've been to this part, you know it dominates the landscape, right? It's a major form that's in X that you cannot avoid. But he's been in the Louvre, he's looked at Poussin, he's looked at these old master landscapes, and he wants to do something similar that has this classical longevity of the place. So he will actually go up to his sister's farm in which is called Bellevue, and set up his easel and paint the mountain. So this is what would be to his back, and then he would look from there to this mountain. And so this is the view that he paints over and over and over again. And essentially, he just gives you the awareness of the mountain. And this is the time when he's painting Gardin. This is this moment in 1885 when landscape is becoming a crucial part of his practice, and he's breaking things down to their essence, wandering through these hills in Provence and painting these houses that almost take on, you know, they almost look like they have personalities, if you will. And this is when he paints the Domaine Saint-Joseph as well. Some images of where he's living in the Jas de Buffon. And I'm assuming that you're going to see imagery in the MoMA show that speaks to all of these places, because they're very important places to him. The Saint-Victoire, the Jas de Buffon, the towns around in the region, but also certainly the card players. And this is where he infuses life into these locals. Most of them were workers from the Jas de Buffon, but he knew them well, but he ennobles them. He really gives them agency. He gives them integrity. He gives them dignity. They're very humble, but he really appreciates that humility. And he uses this format of the card players, and he does an entire series, and I'm sure you're going to see some drawings that relate to it, but there are 5 major paintings that are in public, that are in collections. Not all the paintings travel. The Barnes painting, which you see on the left, never leaves. And there's also a painting, a card playing painting that's in Russia that never travels. So they are public collections. But this card playing tradition goes all the way back to French painting in the 17th century, with Valentin Bologna painting card players. And of course, he's looking at Caravaggio. And then, of course, the tradition continues with Chardin. So there is a whole tradition of French artists painting these card players. And what Cezanne is really doing is updating the card game. and making it very local, making it very communal. It's more to me about the fraternity of these men than anything else. And, you know, when you look at these pictures, you really do get the sense of the personalities of these people. And you really do feel like you're getting underneath the skin. Much more than you do with Hortense. I think it's very interesting. They don't seem as remote. I think he has more respect for them. I think he has more of a connection with them, more of an affinity with them than you see. And these are very beloved works. This was actually a card player that sold at auction, a smaller image that sold for $250 million. So pretty effective. Cezanne still holds his own in the auction world. Now, just finally, in terms of the last section of work that I want to talk about, this is the large bathers. And this is a draw. So this is in the Met's collection, but I think it's the kind of thing you're going to see at MoMA. Because it is a marvelous work on paper, and it combines the landscape of Saint-Victoire with the very famous bather. And I would almost, again, I don't know what's in the show yet, but I can assure you that you will see the bather. And this was one of the most important works given to MoMA when they opened their doors. Lily Bliss gives this painting, and it's always was, for many, many years, it was the first work you saw when you walked into the 5th floor of MoMA. You still see it, not quite as pronounced, but it highlights and announces Cezanne as the beginning of modern art. And the bathers are really all about volume and form and these spatial relationships. And the bather, you know, is something that is very important to him. Now his parents will die. He will sell the Jas du Buffon, but he will build a very large studio with enormously high ceilings that allow for him to make these enormous paintings of bathers. And these bathers really, again, it's the same idea, kind of getting down to the essence of what it is to understand the female form. And you can see how it really impacts the work of people like Picasso and the work of Matisse, and really kind of offers them a model by which to follow. Now, one of the last paintings I want to talk about is this painting of Saint-Victoire. And it's a painting that he did at the end of his life, 1902, 1906. And he was actually, believe it or not, a critic, a writer came and interviewed him and brought a photographer. And they believe that Cezanne is actually painting. They photographed. It's unbelievable that Cezanne allowed them to photograph him. But he's up at his sister's farm in Bellevue, and he's painting Saint-Victoire, and this is the painting, and many people believe that it's this painting that he's painting. But I love this quote that he said in the conversation that he had when the photograph is being taken with the critic. He said the following: "Look at Saint-Victoire there. What elan, what imperious thirst for the sun, and what melancholy in the evening, when all the weight sinks back. Those blocks were made of fire. There's still fire in them. During the day, shadows seem to draw with a shiver to be afraid of them. Plato's cave is up there. Note how, when large clouds pass overhead, their shadows quiver on the rocks as if burnt up, instantly consumed by a mouth of fire." So he's looking, he's seeing these things, and he's thinking about Plato and the forms, the higher forms, the pure forms. You know, Plato encouraged the artist, the philosopher king, to get out of the cave and to see the true forms. And that's what I think Cezanne is doing in these paintings. He says, "I work obstinately, I glimpse the promised land. I've made some progress. Why so late and so painfully? Is art then a priesthood demanding pure beings who belong to it completely?" And I think that is such a comment on the journey that he takes. And I wanted to think finally about these unfinished works as they impacted a particular artist, a man named Luc Tuymans. And Tuymans was asked to create a painting for an exhibition that was called Documented 2002. And all of the works in the show were to speak about 9/11. And what Tuymans decided to do was to paint an image that was based on an unfinished still life watercolor. And you may see this in the show, I don't know, by Cezanne. And it was a work that he had become obsessed with. And he looked at it over and over and over. He studied it and he photographed it. And he felt that there was something quintessential about form and life that was captured in this still life. And what he did was he went into, so this painting is done around the same time as the two other works that I showed you. So and this is the picture, it's very, very large, done by Toymans. And what Toymans did was he went into his studio after studying this still life for many, many, many weeks. And he started at 9 in the morning and he set his alarm for 9 at night and he worked furiously on it based on memory. And he created this image. And when asked about it, how does this relate to 9/11, right? And he said the following: I was asked to create the most political image I'd ever made, and I gave them still life. It is actually a political statement because it is apolitical. The lack of statement is quite important as a position. That was also why I painted it at the time. So unlike painting a work that would speak to the horrors of 9/11, which is what Gerhard Richter did, I think Toymans wanted to say, you can't represent this. And I'd rather look to an image, a work that fully makes me appreciate the life here and now. Still life. I'm still alive. We're still here. And how can we stop time? How can we slow down in this world in which we live? And I think that the work of Cezanne, particularly the unfinished, sketchy style, the images you see on paper, offer you an opportunity to slow down and to think about life and to, bring your heart rate down a bit and to really consider what is still life and how you live. Now, what I'd like to do in my final moments is, because I feel like we're still not quite out of COVID yet, and I feel one of the things that Cezanne does is really transport you to the south of France. So what I'd like to do, thinking about still life and calming us down and bringing us to the essential forms and the essential elements of life, I'd like to share a very quick video with you that shows you the studio of Cezanne, and I think really places all this work in this beloved part of the south of France. So I'm happy to stop my share now and answer any questions that anybody might have. And Amanda, if you see anything in the Q&A, I'm not seeing anything at the moment, but maybe we have some questions.
Sure. I have a question for you, and you might have brushed by this a bit. My theory was that Cezanne, since he liked to, have the feel that he was a country bumpkin, that maybe he lied about his relationship with his father just to, I don't know.
Well, I think that the father had a very complicated relationship with him on a lot of levels, because his father had also kind of come from humble origins and had kind of made it. And he wanted his son to he had a predetermined idea of what he wanted him to do. So I think Cezanne never felt that he measured up. And the fact that he never sold any paintings seemed to confirm to his father that occupation that he was trying to achieve as an artist, that he had failed. So it's a very complicated thing. I think he had an admiration for his father, but also there was a failure. And again, Meyer Shapiro has written a lot about that too. There's been a lot of discussion about the psychological relationship with the father, but the father was, I think, again, he allowed him to do all that he did. He gave him the allowance and he allowed him to participate in that life. So it's a complicated relationship, but I do love the painting because I think that it does belie that antagonistic relationship because he let him paint him. And as I said, there's the still life behind.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of beautiful
yeah.
to think about that moment. We have a question for you. Someone wants to know, do you have any formal training? Oh, sorry. So did he have any formal training, and did he have an art teacher that was influential?
Oh, that's actually a very good question. He really didn't, when he went to Paris, he, studied randomly here and there, but he didn't really have a teacher. He never really went to art school. He didn't go, he tried to involve himself in the école and he wasn't a participant. So I think his teacher really was, he went to the natural world. And one of the reasons why his work is seen as so fresh and so unique and so new is that he wasn't tainted by, Monet and Renoir. They all actually, they all meet up at a painter studio, but he's not participating in that. So he really doesn't have any kind of formal training that, his contemporaries would have, impressionists or not. But the answer is basically no. That's a good question. As I said, I truly apologize that if the show was at the Met, I could have given you a full preview and I would have known everything that's in the show. They have been very cagey about what's going to be in the exhibition. So I couldn't really, I'm kind of thinking, oh, this is probably what's going to be in the exhibition. I'm expecting they're going to show this, but I really don't know. The only thing I'm sure of is that you'll see that Lily Bliss bather. That should be, who benefited financially from the sale of his paintings after Cezanne's death. His son, Paul, was the one, because basically, but Paul then supported Hortense. So there was a relationship between the two, but Paul was the beneficiary of the sales for sure. But that's a very good question.
Now, do you have a favorite painting of his that you appreciate the most?
Well, I have to say, and this is probably going to surprise you. I actually really like the Hortense portrait because to me, it just raises all of these interesting questions about why would a woman stay with a man for 17 years who hid her from his family, who didn't like, she didn't like his friend. What was behind that relationship? And there's something about that painting, it won't give it away. So I love that. I also have to say, I love the apples. I really do love those apples. I go into the Met, and the Met has a tremendous collection of his still life of apples. And it's just a joyous burst of color. And I really do feel like the apples kind of take me to the south of France. I'm a huge lover of Provence. It's one of my favorite places in the world. So for me, I look at those apples, those still life paintings, and not all of them were done in Provence. Some of them were done in Paris, but they take me down there. That's why I showed the images of the studio at the end, because I wanted to kind of make you have a feeling of how that Provençal landscape so infused everything he did. So I would say, or the portrait of Hortense, but I really do love I love the apples. And I don't think there's anything sexual about them. I think they're
apples.
Just beautiful forms. I think they're just apples, but that's me.
Did Cezanne have a close relationship with any of his contemporaries?
Yes, well, very close with Pissarro. And he had, when he joined the Impressionists, Degas did not care for him. Degas thought he was too rough and tumble. Mary Cassatt originally was really kind of very standoffish with him because she thought he was so rough, but then she later came to appreciate it. He became closer to Monet towards the end of his life. In fact, one of the still lifes that I showed you was actually owned by Monet. But in the later years, he really became a hermit. He was not someone that was, and when you think about like Monet and Renoir painting side by side, or Degas and Cassatt going to different parts of Paris, he had that relationship with Pissarro. Pissarro would have been the one, he was the link, and that was the close relationship, that was the close friendship. And Pissarro was the older of the two, kind of almost like and some people have said he's a father figure. But Pizarro also participated in all of the exhibitions of the Impressionist group, and he was kind of often seen as the glue that held the Impressions together. So that was the way in which Cezanne became a part of this group. But I always do underscore when I teach Impressionism that the Impressionists were not a cohesive group. There were sort of factions within the Impressionists. What brought them together was their desire to exhibit outside of the salon system. They were so constantly rejected by the jury, and Cezanne suffered a lot of rejection, as did they all, that they said, okay, we're all going to get together and show independently. So it was more about the venue and the exhibiting than a particular style that united them. And then the reviewer says, oh, these impressions, they look like, you know, dabs, they look like wallpaper, it looks like an impression, these are the Impressionists. And then the title sticks. But they weren't, I mean, there isn't a thread through which they all, other than this desire to exhibit privately, that they all adhered to. And I would argue that he was not an easy guy to be friends with. I mean, Zola and he are best friends for 20 or 30 years. And then when Zola publishes this novel, they never speak to each other again. He was recognized as being a difficult, kind of cranky, crusty guy, kind of a loner by the end of his life.
Thank you. And then one last question. Someone wants to know, what is the Met going to put on post-pandemic? If you know.
Oh,
oh.
Well, I do know that we're having a show on the Medici that's opening shortly, and there is. I'm a little loath to say what I know is coming up in the fall because nothing's been officially put out. So I'm not gonna.
Yeah, mom's the word.
Secrets because everything's changed. You know, the issue now is the loans that were negotiated for some of these things have been unable to be realized. So a lot of these shows, like the Medici show that is now opening in June, was supposed to open back in April, but because of the backup with COVID, but that's going to be a great show. And it's kind of the follow-up to the Renaissance portraiture show that was up, oh gosh, 10 years ago, maybe. It's kind of the second half. There's a great show on women photographers that's opening. And then the costume exhibition is going to be on American fashion. So those things I can tell you about. But I know there are going to be one or two other great kind of blockbustery shows that are planned for the fall. But I don't want to speak out of turn.
It's fine. I know we're at time, but one more question, if that's okay with you. Someone would like you to recommend a favorite biography of Cezanne.
Oh, well, you know, there's so many of them. I would say my favorite biography of Cezanne. It's a good question. I mean, there's so many art historians who've written on them. I like Meyer Shapiro, and it's not really biography, it's more scholarly. Ruth Baker's written a lot on Hortense, so is Susan Sidlauskas. There's Roger Fry, there's Meyer Shapiro, there's a whole there's a whole group of scholars that have talked about him. Off the top of my head, I can't really give you that, but there was one biography that I liked and I can't remember the name of it. So maybe that means it's time for me to stop talking. But what was the name of Zola's novel based on? It was called L'Oeuvre, which translates as the work, but it means masterpiece. So L'Oeuvre in French, but it would be known as masterpiece. I think it's translated as masterpiece or masterwork in English. And it's a pretty good read. I mean, you can really see how Cezanne would have been angered by by that. And again, in terms of like movies, watch the Cezanne et moi. It's in French, it has subtitles, but it really does show you the life, and it shows you, you know, his relationship with his family and his relationship with Hortense, and gives you a little window into the whole kind of personality, I think, of Cezanne. through the eyes of Emile Zola. So it's a good
I have
one.
to see
But
if it's in
I
the
have to
collection.
apologize. There is a novel, there's a biography, and I can see it, and it's haunting me, but I don't remember who it's by.
If
So
you remember, email me and I will pass it
I
on.
will.
Thank you. Thank you, Paige. This has been fascinating, and I'm
My
really looking
complete
forward to
pleasure.
this.
I always love being with, I'm from Greenwich, but don't tell Greenwich. I always love the Darien Library. You all are marvelous and always wonderful participants, and I always appreciate your support and your interest and your continued engagement. So thanks, and have a fabulous summer, everybody.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can, get back into the museums a little bit more and get things back to normal, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you, Amanda. You've been a marvelous
Thank you so
host.
much.
And again, thanks to all for being with me. So thank you so much. Be well.
Have a great night. Thank you, everyone.